This is the Science Communicator, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Professor Ela Gumienna-Kontecka from the University of Wrocław and Dr. Jozsef Pap from the Hungarian Research Network. And the topic today is hydrogen. Hydrogen as a potential source of main source, perhaps, of green energy alternative to fossil fuels. Hydrogen is the lightest and the most abundant element in the universe, but here we might say easier said than done as far as obtaining and storing hydrogen. It still poses, as far as I understand, numerous challenges, and these are the challenges, among the others, that we are going to talk about today, that I am going to ask my guests about. So, first of all, the question is, how can hydrogen be obtained? Because it's not out there just waiting for us to reach out for it and grab it. So what are the challenges as far as obtaining hydrogen for those purposes?
Beata, thank you for the kind invitation, first of all. And yeah, let's dive into it. You are absolutely right about the properties of hydrogen and why it is important. So I'm almost jobless sitting here. But about your question, what are the challenges and why we regard hydrogen as the most promising energy source or fuel of the future? Let's first try to understand how we obtain hydrogen. And we must first shift our attention to what it actually represents. So they call hydrogen the queen of elements, but we must be careful not to mistake her for a primary energy source. In reality, hydrogen is an energy carrier, and I prefer that terming. Think of it as a battery or a hydrocarbon without the carbon. When we burn traditional fuels, we get energy, but we pay a heavy price in carbon dioxide. With hydrogen, the only byproduct is water, which is the very essence of life. But let's be honest for a moment about our history. For over a century, fossil fuels have provided us with safety and comfort. They have built our modern world. But that comfort has come with a catastrophic trade-off, which is carbon dioxide and the great emissions. The extensive use of these non-renewables represents the greatest self-inflicted threat humankind has ever faced. And our current crisis, the greenhouse gases and the pollutants, the culture of waste, as I call it, all stem from a dangerous and century-old delusion, the idea that nature's resilience was infinite. We thought she could withstand any load we placed on her, but we were wrong, of course. And we must also realize that fossil fuels were a gift from the past. They are essentially ancient solar energy that was harvested by living organisms and refined over millions of years by geological time. But hydrogen is different. So pure hydrogen does not just sit in the ground waiting for us to drill. We cannot simply drill for it, and we must manufacture her. We have to invest energy upfront and tearing it away from molecules like water or methane before we can hope to get any energy back from it. So to produce this carrier, we currently use three primary colors of technology. Most hydrogen today is produced by the steam methane reforming. So from methane, again a fossil. This we call gray hydrogen. They use high temperature steam to break down natural gas. While efficient, it releases significant carbon dioxide, meaning it does not solve the carbon problem. So when the name SMR process, the same SMR process incorporates carbon capture and storage. When we capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to trap the emissions before they reach the atmosphere, we call this produced hydrogen blue. So it's an intermediate solution. But true green hydrogen is produced via electrolysis using renewable electricity, wind and solar, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So this is the only truly carbon neutral pathway, or nearly carbon neutral pathway. While hydrogen is very tempting as a chemical energy carrier, it presents some challenges, as you just mentioned, and called the audience attention to it. Because of the laws of thermodynamics, you always get less energy out of hydrogen than you invest to create it. So we must ensure the initial energy comes from a surplus of renewables to make it worth it. And hydrogen is the smallest molecules, as you just mentioned, and it is notorious for leaking through seals and making high-strength steel brittle. So hydrogen embrittlement, as they call it in industry. So even the hardest materials face a problem when it's about hydrogen. So storing it also requires extreme pressures, and imagine 700 bars, so 700 times the atmospheric pressure, or cryogenic cooling, which is down to minus 253 degrees Celsius. So while hydrogen has the highest energy content by weight, it has a very low energy density by volume. So this makes it a challenge for example, smaller passenger cars, but it might be ideal for heavy shipping, aviation, and steel manufacturing as a raw material.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you've mentioned water electrolysis. Electrolysis, is that the proper way of pronouncing the word? I hope.
Exactly.
So what are the limitations as far as this process is concerned?
It is helpful to water electrolysis not just as a chemical reaction, but as a vital bridge between the power grid and the hydrogen economy. While we rely increasingly on renewable electricity, this transition presents a fundamental challenge. Renewable energy is diffuse, geographically constrained, and most critically, intermittent. For instance, during the day, solar panels produce far more electricity than the grid requires, yet production ceases entirely at night. And similarly, when wind energy fluctuates unpredictably, the result is that these energy peaks often do not align with our consumption. So this temporal and spatial mismatch between production and demand must be bridged. And one of the most promising solutions is to use hydrogen as the energy carrier, and the perfect interface is electrolysis. So through electrolysis, surplus renewable electricity can be used to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. This allows us to store this solar and wind energy when it is available, and releasing it when exactly it is needed on demand. So at its core, electrolysis uses electrical energy to split water molecules into their constituent parts, hydrogen and oxygen gas. And this process occurs within an electrolyzer where two electrodes, an anode and a cathode, are separated by an electrolyte, which is perfectly fine as water. When a direct current is applied between the two electrodes, protons and water molecules are reduced at the cathode to generate hydrogen gas, while water and hydroxide ions are oxidized at the anode to produce oxygen. The beauty of this process lies in the sustainability. If the electricity comes from renewables like wind, solar, or hydro, the result is green hydrogen. This fuel carries nearly zero carbon footprint throughout its entire life cycle, from production to combustion. Its use in fuel cells or its application in the industry as raw material has been solved for decades. However, these electrode processes are only commercially feasible if efficient catalysts are employed. And these materials are essential to minimize the so-called overpotential, so the extra energy price of hydrogen that is required to drive the reaction and to suppress unwanted side reactions. By reducing the energy demand of electrolysis, catalysts directly lower operational costs, which is crucially given that renewable electricity remains a premium resource. So why don't we use this everywhere? One might ask this question. Despite its elegance, and electrolysis poses several real-world problems that keep it from replacing fossil fuel-based hydrogen today. First, we have to talk about the energy tax. Thermodynamics is tough. You lose energy at every single step. So you lose it as heat during electrolysis, you lose it during compression for storage, and you lose it again when you convert it back to electrical power in a fuel cell. Right now, the round-trip efficiency is roughly 30 to 40 degrees merely. On paper, that makes hydrogen look much less efficient than a battery, but here is the trick. So if I asked you to invest your hard-earned money and told you that you would only get like 40% back, you would walk away. This is a horrible idea. But what if I told you that 100% of your money was currently being wasted, just thrown away on taxes and unnecessary fees, for example, and I have a solution that can save 40% of it? Now, suddenly, that's a very attractive offer, right? Yes. And that is exactly the situation with curtailed renewable energy to manage oversupply. Currently, when the production is too high for the grid to handle, we simply turn off the turbines. We throw that energy away. Hydrogen allows us to stop wasting that tax, as I called it in the parallel, and start recovering energy that would otherwise lost to the wind. So another key limitation is the catalyst scarcity that I want to talk about. The most efficient and durable electrolyzers are called PEM electrolyzers, or proton exchange membrane types. And those electrolyzers rely on platinum group metals, iridium at the anode and platinum at the cathode. So these are among the rarest and most expensive elements on Earth. So scaling this to a global level requires finding Earth-abundant alternatives like nickel or iron-based catalysts, for example. And catalysts that can survive the harsh conditions inside the cell. And partly because of the expensive catalysts, the capital expenditure, the capex, is very high. So building an electrolysis plant is much more expensive than building a traditional steam methane reforming plant, for example. And while the cost of renewable energy is falling, the stack cost, the stack of cells, the actual cost of the electrolyzer remains high due to complex manufacturing and expensive membranes. So all the components are very expensive. And last but not least, you cannot simply throw a bucket of water into a high-end electrolyzer. Most current technologies require deionized, highly purified water. And using seawater or wastewater, for example, leads to side reactions, like chlorine gas evolution from the chloride content of seawater, or poisoning of the expensive catalyst by the different organic waste components in wastewater. And this adds an extra layer of pre-treatment cost and energy, of course. And the limitation of electrolysis is not the chemistry itself. We have known the chemistry for 2 centuries. The limitation is the economics of scale and the scarce material used. So we are currently challenged to move from a precious metal catalyst to earth-abundant materials while simultaneously lowering the energy tax paid during the conversion process.
Yes, so as far as splitting water, of course, I'm a layperson, but splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen is a process which is part of something you have mentioned before, Jozsef, photosynthesis, something that plants have been doing for billions of years. And this is a fascinating biological process. And I understand that scientists are able now to take advantage of something that I understand you call artificial photosynthesis in the process of obtaining hydrogen. So what does this consist in? How can you manage that as researchers?
All right. Yes, I give the word to Ela because she is more familiar with biological systems. So maybe
Yes.
at this point, concerning these particular questions, she could do a better introduction.
I would just like to come back to the production of hydrogen. To complete that section, we may just turn into nature, which has developed an elaborate hydrogen economy already in the pre-oxygen area, when gases like methane, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen predominated. And it continues to use it right now under some certain specific conditions. So, namely, the interconversion between protons and molecular hydrogen, in other words, consumption and production of hydrogen gas, it is catalyzed by some very, very efficient and ancient enzymes called hydrogenases. So in some anaerobic microorganisms right now, hydrogen production serves as a mechanism to get rid of reducing potential. In some others, it is coupled to the reduction of carbon dioxide, oxygen, or other electron acceptors. And at the same time, this process is used to generate a proton gradient for the production of ATP as a source of energy, which we need every moment in our life. So for manipulating hydrogen, those enzymes utilize non-precious metal ions. So they utilize metal ions which are very abundant, like iron, or less abundant, like nickel. And we have two types of, or three types of hydrogenases, where in the center, the catalytic part is built of iron and nickel, or in case when nickel is limited, it is built of iron centers. So, and in this case, the formation of methane and CO2 catalyzed by some methanogenic archaea could represent a very efficient way to store hydrogen.
Thank you, Ela. And indeed, these natural systems give impetus in the field of the research for artificial systems. And particularly these hydrogenase enzymes inspired a lot of fundamental research and nowadays also applied research, also in the field of artificial photosynthesis.
Yes, exactly. So if we want to come to artificial photosynthesis, maybe we can simply say that we again start from the what nature was using. Mm-hmm. So not to reinvent the wheel. We think what was done. So let's have a look on a leaf. For example, for billions of years, plants have taken three simple and abundant ingredients like sunlight, water, and CO2, and put it together to create fuel. And so taking it really literally, it was the most efficient and successful energy project in the history of Earth.
Yes, yes, that's very true. So it is very essential to understand artificial photosynthesis by putting the natural process into perspective as a masterpiece of energy storage. Because this was, the natural oxygenic photosynthesis, a singular event in history, and it has fundamentally shaped our biosphere since the first light-powered life forms appeared. So when a plant performs this solar to chemical conversion, it creates carbohydrates, sugar, to fuel its own life. So over millions of years, a massive portion of those organic compounds became fossilized and forming the feedstock we know as fossil fuels nowadays. And we consume it in just almost less than a century. On the contrary, artificial photosynthesis is or attempt to master the same process to our benefit, but instead of growing trees, we are trying to grow an economy of ours. So we are building man-made systems that capture solar energy to split water. Yet instead of making sugar, we produce green hydrogen. And think of the elegance that loop. We take the sunlight and water from the earth, like nature does, to create high energy gas. When we use that gas, it turns back into water and no carbon and no waste. And as usual, we face a humbling challenge. Nature has had 4 billion years to perfect her catalysis, and we have had only a few decades. But here is the most important lesson we can decipher from the leaf, one that goes beyond mimicking only the chemistry. Because nature inserted and employs feedback loops in the systems. And this is the lesson, the take-home lesson for us. Without proper coupling and feedback, no system can survive. In nature, every individual function part is perfectly integrated into a balanced whole. And I believe this is the vital piece of knowledge for us. And no matter how efficient or profitable or individual artificial parts become, they will never create a truly balanced renewable system unless we learn to couple them as effectively as the leaf does. And our goal isn't just to make better catalysts, it is to build a system that finally works in harmony with the planet's energy cycles. So in harmony with nature, in other words.
Yes, for sure. So yes, right now I would like to ask you about a project, an innovative project in which you are both involved. The PacemCAT project. Again, do I pronounce it correctly?
It is pronounced PacemCAT because pacem means peace in Latin, and that was the inspiration to give this name.
I see.
And
Okay.
I think you will understand the details if I introduce the collaboration network in more details, because this is an international project which is focused on advancing green hydrogen production. Its full title is Photoanodes Advanced by Cost-Effective Catalysts to Secure Future Solar Hydrogen. It was launched in early 2025, and the project is funded by the European Union's Horizon program under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Action Staff Exchanges program. It is a true pan-European effort led by the Hungarian Research Network's Center for Energy Research in Hungary, where I am working. I am personally the coordinator, and we have assembled a team of 8 partners across 7 countries, blending academic research skills from versatile fields with industrial pragmatism. By bridging together specialists from fields as diverse as macromolecular chemistry and industrial engineering, we can solve problems that no single lab could tackle alone. Our partners include prestigious institutions like Uppsala University and the University of Wrocław, and research-oriented joint laboratories like the Cobra Laboratory in France and the Democritos Institute in Greece, Athens, and agile industrial partners, small to medium enterprises, SMEs, like Amen New Technologies and IDC ABN from Ukraine, one of our most productive partners. The leader is the Hungarian Research Network Center for Energy Research in Hungary. And we coordinate the work, and we host several secondments from all other institutions, and we send out researchers to learn the methodologies that are applied day by day at different institutions, but unknown to us. So this mutual learning process is very useful when we have to match pieces of such a puzzle like an artificial photosynthesis system together. Because splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen is incredibly difficult. Currently, it requires precious metals like iridium and platinum, as I mentioned, which are too rare and expensive for global use. So we are moving away from those expensive materials, and instead we are developing catalysts using more abundant elements like iron, cobalt, and nickel. The goal is to build a scientific foundation for a hydrogen economy that doesn't rely on a volatile market of the noble metals and rare metals and their scarcity. And we are designing for photoanodes, basically, which are involved in the oxygen evolution part of the reaction, because that's the hardest part and the most energy demanding part. And you can think of these photoanodes as part of a synthetic leaf, and they are solar energy collectors that we immerse in water. Just like a leaf, they have two main jobs. They harvest sunlight, which is the energy source, and drive the chemical reaction, which is to produce hydrogen as the carrier and oxygen out of water splitting. The natural photosynthesis is very complex, and it is also very fragile. And our goal is to create synthetic versions that serve the purpose of hydrogen productions and cheaper than the current solutions. And we aim at catalytic systems that have expanded lifetime and survive the demanding conditions while splitting water. In doing so, we rely largely on complex compounds.
Yes, complex compounds. This is also fascinating. Professor Gumienna-Kontecka and I, we talked about this some time ago, but please remind our listeners, what are complex compounds? Because here enters coordination chemistry, which is also really interesting.
Yes, indeed, we have talked about them, and the complex compounds, they are very versatile and very useful in many areas. So to understand how to build the metal complexes or complex compounds, it helps to think of them as a highly versatile platform. And we can say that we play Lego with special building blocks in complex chemistry. So the complexes or coordination compounds, these are molecular structures which possess a central part, which is surrounded by specific and specialized arrangements of other pieces. So these are chemical compounds which are built from two or more independent stable compartments. One is the core, and in the complexes that we are thinking of, in the core we have metal ions, transition metal ions, which are especially interested for us in the project, like iron or copper, cobalt, or the nickel that was mentioned by us. And these transition metal ions are unique because they have vacant slots, we may say, in their electron shells. And this allows them to bind the other entities at once around. These entities that we are imagining, they are so-called ligands. They can ligare, so just connect to the central molecules, and these ligands are like oxygen or nitrogen or much more complex organic compounds, and they are able to donate electrons and form the coordination bond, which is here especially important. So they match together like in Lego pieces, and they can be very diverse and form very diverse structures. And this diversity is bringing really interesting features to the metal ions. So the formation of like in the bricks, the formation of stronger or less strong bonds and different architectures is also influencing the central metal ion, so the properties of the central metal ion, and changing the pieces of this construction helps to tune these properties and the properties we may imagine, color of the compound, but also magnetic properties of the compounds. And what is the most interesting in terms of in the connection to our proposal, it terms the catalytic properties of the compounds, of the complexes.
So yes, of course, a catalyst is something that speeds up chemical reactions, right? In layman's terms. So what will be the role of these complex compounds in hydrogen production by water splitting, and why is it such an innovative method?
Well, in this project, molecular catalysts, or these complexes that Ela very nicely introduced and explained to us, are treated as precision workpieces that can be rationally tuned to achieve peak efficiency at the atomic level. So these are very small entities which can be very nicely tuned by changing the Lego bricks around them, as Ela just said. So this means that they are grafted on the surface of the photoelectrode, where they are expected to accelerate the chemical reaction as a catalyst, as you mentioned, Beata. However, these molecular entities are often intrinsically very vulnerable, so they tend to degrade under the harsh conditions that I just mentioned earlier. So the very reactivity that we seek can lead to the degradation of the organic ligands. And this is the weak point of the system. And we try to identify these weak points, and we can re-engineer the compound to overcome its flaws. So in this context, experimentation acts as a design feedback loop. So this is the traditional research approach that we apply. But research often leads to dead ends and unforeseeable issues also that we didn't think of beforehand. So we consider this as the most exciting part of the process, because we confront, unknown problems and try to decipher the logic behind the complex systems and their failures. Mm-hmm. So this iterative approach allows us to develop a new generation of complexes while simultaneously mapping out pitfalls. And the primary challenge is the tendency of organic compounds to undergo unwanted oxidation at the photoanode. The second challenge involves the light harvesting component, which represents a fundamental problem in material science. There are also limitations to these materials. And the third problem lies in the integration of these two very different components, and specifically how to effectively combine molecules with solid materials. And this is the most innovative part of our project, that we brought together specialist groups from material science and from the molecular science field, and also small industrial partners that shows us how to, implement things and apply the inventions that we achieved during the project. So through a smart design and this target-oriented approach, we can actually exploit the oxidative activation of complexes and fabricate robust new catalysts. That's our hope. And it is a very complex undertaking, which is precisely why we prioritize the collective expertise gained through our international collaboration.
Yes, for sure. It is much more complex than we lay people might think, but truly fascinating. So what are the prospects? What do you think for the future as far as this project, other projects are concerned, and actually being able to use hydrogen as main, or one of the main sources of energy?
So we truly hope that our results will contribute to the pool of knowledge of artificial photosynthetic systems, and we can show some nice examples and implementations of utilizing these so-called first-row transition metal elements in complex forms, and why this research has some practical outlooks, but also it's very important to understand that through learning and through improving our knowledge, we can understand more and more about the natural systems. And we can find a nice way to, introduce the people, your listeners, for example, this paradigm shift from fossils to renewables, and how to use the renewable energy and how to store it in a proper way. So I don't want to paraphrase here, but truly by the end of this project, we hope to come up with some selected transition metal complexes that can be matched well with the light harvesting materials, which are semiconductors. And we can demonstrate that such combinations can work for over several tens of hours or days or weeks even. So that's our highest hope. Of course, scalability is another issue. So we work, because we are researchers in laboratories, we work in small laboratories where small scale devices can be developed. And these can supply with essential initial input information of larger pieces of devices in the future. That's out of the scope of this project, but you never know if something really works, and we hope that we have some really good ideas about both the complexes and the semiconductors. If we can match these two very different kinds of materials together, some surprising results may come out of it.
It's great. Thank you so much for spending some time with me and talking about these fascinating details of your method, of your project, and of the very processes that you are researching. Thank you once again. I think this was a very, very informative, educating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Beata, for the kind invitation. I'm always glad to share information about the project.
That's great. Thank you so much.